Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
I got fired on a Tuesday right before lunch, which is probably the most humiliating time to get canned if you're wondering. You walk in with a stomach full of hope and an inbox full of things you still plan to fix, and you walk out wondering if you should still validate your parking. It wasn't loud, dramatic, or even particularly emotional. That's what made it worse. No raised voices, no pointing fingers, just a short meeting request on my calendar titled Check In, Carl. I thought maybe we were finally getting around to talking through the Q3 debacle, or possibly scheduling that client pitch Drew had been hounding me about. Instead, it was Carl, my boss of 7 years, and someone from HR whose name I didn't recognize, sitting there with polite expressions and manila folders. Carl Bennett was the type of guy who always smiled like he knew something you didn't, and today it was clear he did. He started with, "Thanks for coming in, Rob," and ended with, "This is never easy, but the company has decided to go in a different direction." That was corporate speak for, "We picked someone younger, louder, and sneakier, and no, you don't get to argue." No review of the facts, no talk of the 23 successful product launches I'd led, no mention of how I'd spent 2 weeks of unpaid nights fixing the client data breach last winter, while Drew was off on some leadership retreat in Napa Valley. Just a soft-spoken HR woman named Kim reading off a script, telling me I'd have 2 weeks of severance, I'd need to return my laptop, and I wasn't allowed to contact any clients directly. Like I was some kind of liability. Like I'd burned the place down on my way out. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I didn't even blink. Maybe that's what unnerved them. I just sat there, nodded once, and waited for Carl to look me in the eye. He didn't. Of course he didn't. He'd made his move. I was dead weight in a spreadsheet now, a number made easier to delete thanks to the story Drew had been feeding him for months. Because here's the thing. I wasn't fired because I screwed up. I was fired because Drew Pearson, my junior project associate, was better at optics than I was. The guy had a neck like a giraffe and a smile that belonged on a toothpaste ad. He called everyone boss, laughed at Carl's dry jokes like they were HBO specials, and always somehow showed up with Starbucks for the team 5 minutes before any big meeting. But behind the scenes, he was playing chess while I was still solving crosswords. And I didn't see it. At first, I thought Drew was just enthusiastic. He'd ask a lot of questions, offer to help with minor tasks, take notes during calls, and send follow-up emails like clockwork. I thought, great, finally someone under 30 who gives a damn. But slowly, things got weird. Documents went missing. Deadlines were moved. Clients started asking questions I hadn't been looped into. Then came the big one, the launch of the Polaris project, our golden goose. I'd spent almost 6 months building that thing out, coordinated with 4 different departments, pulled all-nighters, missed my kids' science fair, and even ran budget approvals through vacation. But when it launched, there was a critical flaw in the API structure. Our biggest client pulled their contract within 48 hours. Carl was furious, and I had no real defense, because the documentation Drew had handled, the one update I never reviewed, that's where the bug originated. And Drew? He looked just as shocked as I did. Even told me, "Man, I don't know how that slipped through. You always catch that stuff." I didn't know it at the time, but that line was the final nail. Because what Carl heard wasn't Rob missed something, it was Rob's slipping. And when you're 51 and still waiting for that director title, slipping is the last thing they'll forgive you for, especially when a shiny 28-year-old is sitting next door, eager and spotless. So I packed up my things. Well, not much. Just a photo of my wife and daughter, a stress ball from a vendor summit back in 2017, and a mug that said, "World's Okayest Manager." A few coworkers gave me the sympathetic nod, the kind you give when you don't want to be seen choosing sides. Only Mark, from the dev team, walked me out. He didn't say much, just handed me a USB drive and muttered, "Thought you might want this," before heading back in. I shoved it in my jacket pocket and didn't ask questions. What would you do if a coworker threw you under the bus and your boss handed them the keys to your car afterward? It wasn't until later that night, sitting in my garage with a six-pack and no appetite, that I realized I wasn't just fired. I was erased, like a ghost, like I'd never been there. That's the part that really guts you. Not losing the job, but realizing you were never as safe as you thought. And somewhere Drew Pearson was probably raising a glass at happy hour, laughing about how he pulled it off. I bet he thought I'd vanish quietly. And for a while, I almost did. But the thing about patience, it gets sharper when you sit with it long enough. And ghosts, sometimes they come back with receipts. It's easy to miss the start of a trap when it's wrapped in compliments and caffeine. That's how it began with Drew Pearson. The guy came in fresh off some business school program, full of jargon and swagger. The type who used the word synergy without irony and wore loafers with no socks. Like that was some kind of personality. At first, I liked him. God help me, I actually liked the kid. He asked smart questions, offered to help with the kind of grunt work no one wanted, and acted genuinely grateful when I took the time to explain how we handled client onboarding or structured cross-team updates. Looking back now, I think he was studying me, not learning from me. Like a fox watching an old hound that doesn't know the traps are already set. I remember one meeting in particular, about 2 months after Drew joined the team. We were presenting a mid-cycle update to a legacy client, high stakes, high maintenance, and prone to blowing up over minor changes. I had put together a detailed walkthrough and even looped in legal to pre-approve the wording. Drew asked if he could run point on the deck just to stretch his wings a little. I said, sure. Why not? Kid's got ambition. Might as well let him flex it. But halfway through the call, he started quoting metrics I hadn't approved, tossing out project timelines that didn't match our current sprint plan, and when the client raised a concern, he smiled and said, "We'll get Rob to clean that up on our end." Just like that, like I was some backstage janitor in my own presentation. I let it slide, thought maybe it was nerves or ego or just a bad choice of words. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and that was my first mistake. Over the next few weeks, the pattern got clearer, but so did my denial. Drew was always around, always checking in, always happy to take it off your plate, Rob, like he was doing me a favor. He'd volunteer for tasks that required visibility, but low accountability, drafting initial project plans, logging client calls, sending follow-ups. That last one, especially. I didn't realize it then, but those follow-up emails? That's where the seeds were being planted. Subtle shifts in narrative, small tweaks to timelines, tiny suggestions that if something was delayed or miscommunicated, it was because Rob's swamped or Rob's probably already on it. It didn't sound like blame. It sounded like teamwork. But he was quietly separating himself from the risk while attaching himself to the successes. I started noticing little glitches. A shared folder would suddenly be locked, with Drew saying, "Oh, must have been a permissions thing, I'll fix it." A calendar invite would go missing, and Drew would apologize, saying he thought I saw the email thread. Files got renamed or moved, versions overlapped, and all the while, I kept telling myself it was just tech gremlins, normal chaos, or maybe I was just tired. I chalked it up to burnout, middle age, too many irons in the fire. But somewhere deep in my gut, I had this twitch. That feeling you get when you know someone's watching you, not to learn, but to replace. I had been running that department longer than Drew had been legally allowed to rent a car, and yet suddenly I felt like I was defending my seat at the table during meetings I used to run. Drew would bring up metrics before I did, answer questions directed at me, and every time I glanced at Carl for backup, he'd just nod along like this was the new normal. I should have said something then. I should have called it out. But you don't want to sound paranoid when everyone else is smiling, do you? You don't want to be the guy who accuses the golden child of sabotage when all you've got is a bad feeling and a few skipped calendar invites. Then came Polaris, the project that would end me. It started off strong. My team knew the structure. I assigned Drew a minor role in documentation and updates, mostly client-facing status reports. I even double-checked the pipeline logic and sat with QA during the stress tests. But somewhere between version 3 and version 5, Drew made a change to the API framework and never pushed it for review. It bypassed the peer check. It bypassed me. I didn't find out until after the launch, when the client called screaming about data not syncing and financial records duplicating. Carl blew a gasket. Legal was CC'd on every email. And Drew? Drew said he assumed I'd reviewed it, like always. That was the word he used. Assumed. As if my trusting him to follow the same protocol we'd used on 10 other projects was some kind of negligence. I felt my stomach drop as I stared at the audit trail. His name was there on the change logs, yes, but the commit note said, pending Rob's final review. That was the trap. No Slack message, no email, no ping, just a note buried in the commit log, vague enough to look like a miscommunication, clean enough to cast doubt. And Carl bought it, or maybe he wanted to. Maybe he'd been looking for an excuse to thin the herd, and Drew just handed him the cleanest out. After that, I was left out of client calls. Drew started sending project updates directly to Carl. I was asked to focus more on internal operations, and when I brought it up, gently, professionally, Carl told me I was imagining things. You've been under a lot of pressure, Rob. Maybe take a long weekend, reset. That's when I knew I was already gone. They just hadn't printed the papers yet. The worst part? I didn't hate Drew for it. Not yet. I hated myself more for not seeing it, for mentoring him, for being so damn proud of how well he was fitting in. I wasn't just being replaced. I was training my replacement and thanking him for the privilege. And when he finally drove the knife in, I didn't even feel it. I was already numb. By the time I walked into that Tuesday morning meeting with Carl in HR, the trap had long since closed. I just hadn't realized I was already bleeding. Losing a job like that doesn't just hit your wallet. It hits your wiring. It rewires how you wake up, how you walk through your house, how you answer the question, so how's work going? When someone at the grocery store makes the mistake of being polite. At first, I told myself I'd bounce back fast. I was experienced. I had references. Well, I used to. I'd built successful teams, turned around broken projects, led million-dollar campaigns, and earned plaques nobody ever asked about. That used to mean something. But after the 4th week of waking up late, refreshing job boards, and rereading the same rejection emails dressed up as, we've decided to move in a different direction, I realized something a lot of people my age eventually face. The game had changed, and I wasn't the player they wanted anymore. I applied everywhere, companies I'd never heard of, startups with names that sounded like medication or app updates, consultancies that listed culture fit above actual experience. I kept tweaking my resume, trimming my job history, shortening titles, softening dates, anything to hide the fact that I wasn't 35 and didn't have a TikTok strategy or a standing desk. I stopped mentioning my age entirely. I stopped mentioning anything that might suggest I remembered life before Slack and emojis in performance reviews. I went from respected manager to invisible applicant in less than 6 weeks. And each time I didn't get a call back, I wondered if Drew had whispered something into someone's ear, just enough poison to taint whatever came next. It wasn't paranoia. I'd seen it before. In our industry, reputations travel faster than facts. You screw up one big launch, your name goes on the informal blacklist, and nobody asks your side of the story. They just assume if your own company dropped you, there must have been a reason. And nobody wants to hire a reason. I heard from Mark a few times, just casual check-ins, but even he was careful. Said there were whispers at the office, but nobody wanted to get caught asking too many questions. Drew had apparently stepped into my role unofficially and was already pushing to rebrand the entire department. Of course he was. That was the plan all along. I stopped shaving. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My wife, Karen, tried to stay positive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She started making lists, bills, groceries, options. I found her looking at part-time nursing jobs, even though she'd been trying to cut back hours. I hated that. I hated being the problem in a house that used to count on me for solutions. And every time my daughter asked why I wasn't going to work, I felt like a liar trying to smile through a mouthful of shame. I started taking long drives, not going anywhere, just moving. I'd put on old rock stations and let the static fill the car when the signal faded. I needed noise, but not the kind that talked back. On one of those drives, I pulled into a strip mall off Route 47 and just sat in the car for an hour, watching the rain slide down the windshield. Something about the stillness felt honest. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was pretending. I stared at the steering wheel and wondered if this was it. If this was the version of myself I was stuck with now. A guy with experience nobody wanted and pride he couldn't afford. Then, one night, something strange happened. I was scrolling through my email at 2 in the morning, deleting spam and ignoring yet another reminder from LinkedIn to add skills to boost your visibility, when I saw a subject line that stopped me cold. Ongoing legal inquiry, Polaris project. At first, I thought it was a scam, some clickbait disguised as official language, but the email address was from a federal domain, and the sender wasn't asking for money or account info. They were requesting a call. They said my name had come up in the preliminary review of Polaris, specifically in connection with documentation inconsistencies and client complaints filed before and after the project launched. My name had come up as a stakeholder, as someone who may have witnessed, or even unknowingly contributed to, irregularities that were now under formal investigation. I read that email 3 times, then I read it again. Something in my chest stirred, not quite hope, not yet, but something like recognition, like maybe I hadn't imagined all of it. Maybe what happened to me wasn't just politics or bad luck. Maybe Drew hadn't just stepped over me to get ahead. Maybe he'd broken more than protocol. Maybe he'd broken the law. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, opened the old external hard drive I hadn't touched since the day Mark handed me that USB, and started digging. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew what I felt when I found it. Dated emails, Slack exports, file versions with metadata intact. Nothing earth-shattering on its own, but together, it painted a pattern. Edits made under my credentials, but at hours I wasn't logged in. Documents with matching timestamps across 2 projects Drew had touched. Language lifted from client memos and dropped into investor decks without disclosure. And that one email. God, that one email. From Drew to Carl, dated 2 weeks before my firing, forwarding an internal update with the subject line, Polaris ownership, cleaning up Rob's mess. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated. And now someone was finally asking the right questions. Someone with subpoena power. Someone who wasn't sipping lattes with Drew in the break room or worried about upsetting Carl's chain of command. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in months, I felt something settle in me. Not rage, not revenge, but clarity. The kind that comes from knowing you're not crazy, that the gaslight was real, and that maybe, just maybe, you weren't the one who needed to disappear. So I wrote back. I told them I'd be happy to talk. And then I waited. Again. But this time, it wasn't in shame. It was in anticipation. The first call came on a Wednesday afternoon, just after I'd returned from a half-hearted grocery run, the kind where you circle the aisles pretending you need things just to avoid going home. I let it ring once, saw the Washington area code, and felt a twist in my stomach that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with old instincts. The kind of tightening you feel when your gut knows something big is shifting. I answered with that hesitant tone we all use when we're expecting spam but hoping for salvation. And then a calm, practiced voice introduced herself as Special Agent Claire Donnelly with the Office of Corporate Integrity, investigating potential violations related to the Polaris product launch and several irregularities in financial reporting connected to internal communications and decision-making chains. She spoke slowly, clearly, like she'd said it 100 times before, which made sense because people like her don't call unless there's already smoke thick enough to choke someone. At first, I didn't say much. I listened, careful not to sound too eager, but also not defensive. She said my name had surfaced during preliminary document review, and that several communication threads between myself, Drew Pearson, and Carl Bennett had been flagged for inconsistencies in narrative alignment. Their phrase, not mine. Apparently, the version of events the company submitted didn't match the digital trails. They had approval chains that disappeared, edit logs that made no sense, and internal statements that conflicted with known deliverables. Claire asked if I'd be willing to speak under voluntary witness status, and I didn't even hesitate. I said yes. I said I had documentation, and that I believed I had been removed under false pretenses following an orchestrated campaign by a subordinate. I didn't say Drew's name right away, but I knew it was already on her list, probably underlined in red. That night, I opened every folder on that old hard drive, including the encrypted backup Mark had secretly handed me. Turns out Mark had been paying closer attention than I realized, because inside that drive were mirrored Slack threads, meeting minutes, private emails between Drew and Carl, and even a few recorded Zoom calls saved locally, one of which captured Drew, while screen sharing, opening an unauthorized admin panel and instructing a junior dev to just adjust the metrics so they line up with Carl's forecast. The dev hesitated. Drew said, "Don't worry, Rob won't catch it. He's spread too thin, and if he does, Carl will have my back." That was the moment it became real. Not just sabotage, but collusion. Not just career-ending pettiness, but outright fraud. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong. I had been spread too thin. I didn't catch it. But now I had the damn receipt. The next day, Claire and I spoke at length. She asked about my role on Polaris, who owned what, how decisions were made, who had final say on key elements, and whether there had been internal pressure to accelerate deadlines or massage data. I answered everything, careful and measured, but I didn't hold back. I told her how I'd originally vouched for Drew, how Carl began excluding me from critical calls weeks before the launch, how I'd noticed subtle shifts in documentation and been unable to verify certain changes because my access had been limited without explanation. I told her how I was the one blamed publicly, but the digital audit pointed elsewhere. She listened without interrupting, took notes, asked for copies of specific files, and thanked me for my time. Before she hung up, she said, "You've just validated a number of concerns we've had. We may need you to testify formally. Would you be willing?" I told her not only would I testify, I would show up with annotated exhibits and color-coded tabs if it helped get the truth out. That weekend, I didn't do much. I didn't celebrate or plan a victory lap. I didn't even tell Karen the details, just that someone had finally asked the right questions, and that maybe, just maybe, things were going to shift. I sat on the back porch, drank 2 fingers of bourbon, and let the wind blow through my faded sweatshirt like it was scrubbing out the weight I'd been carrying for months. There's something dangerous about hope after a long stretch of humiliation. Doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a loaded gun, and you're not sure if you're supposed to hand it over or pull the trigger. By Monday morning, I had organized everything into a tidy digital folder labeled Polaris Evidence, which I sent to Claire through the secure upload link she provided. I included a detailed breakdown of events, cross-referenced Slack messages, meeting logs, change approvals, and highlighted every inconsistency. I even found a company-wide memo Carl sent out 2 weeks after my firing, claiming full responsibility for the final successful pivot on Polaris, despite having never once touched the operational build or attending a single overnight QA session. His name was on the glory, my name was on the blame, and Drew was the smiling bridge between the two, peddling loyalty while cashing in favors. I knew I was walking a tightrope. Blowing the whistle is never clean. There are always consequences, and rarely are they as satisfying as movies pretend. But I also knew I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent, not after seeing how many corners had been cut, how much trust had been violated, and how many people, myself included, had been steamrolled in pursuit of promotions and stock options. By the time Claire called again, she had more questions, deeper ones, about timing, about indirect communications, about Carl's influence on hiring decisions during the weeks leading up to the launch. She mentioned that Drew's name had come up in another inquiry, one unrelated to Polaris, involving suspicious contractor bids and falsified productivity metrics. It was worse than I thought. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a pattern, a blueprint. And I had unknowingly been the first real crack in the wall. I told Claire I was ready to testify whenever they needed me. She said they'd be in touch soon. And when I hung up that phone, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something deeper, a kind of stillness that comes when you finally stop blaming yourself for being the guy who trusted the wrong people. Because now they weren't just hearing my story, they were writing it down. The day I testified, the sky was an unremarkable shade of gray, the kind that doesn't scream disaster or redemption, but simply hangs there, like the world's holding its breath to see which way things are going to fall. I sat in a government building that smelled like old coffee and cheap carpet glue, dressed in the only suit I hadn't buried in the back of my closet, and waited in a room where everything seemed to echo: my breath, the ticking clock, the sound of a man 3 doors down explaining something about procurement fraud with the flat tone of someone who'd told the story too many times already. I wasn't nervous in the way people expect. My hands weren't shaking, and my voice didn't crack when the agent called me in. What I felt was older than nerves. It was a kind of dull heat that sat in the chest, not quite anger anymore, not quite sadness either, just this persistent hum of clarity, the type you earn when you've had months to relive a betrayal, one frame at a time. When I walked into that room and saw the attorneys seated across the table, their folders crisp, their pens poised, and their eyes already halfway through reading me, I understood immediately that they weren't here to argue. They were here to confirm. I was a missing puzzle piece, not the star, not the savior, but the witness they needed to close a loop that had gotten far uglier than just a disgruntled employee and a sneaky promotion. As I sat down, I noticed the folders were thicker than I'd expected, and one had a printed slack thread I recognized, highlighted in yellow, with my name floating in the middle of a back and forth I'd once tried to forget. They asked me to walk them through the timeline, not in general terms, but with precision. Dates, files, specific instances where I'd noticed discrepancies or seen decisions being made outside the normal approval process. They wanted to know when I had first felt something was off, what steps I had taken to address it internally, and most of all, whether I could verify that my warnings, formal or informal, had been ignored or redirected. I gave them everything: the old emails, the forwarded memos, the Slack exports, and even a printed screenshot of Drew's infamous comment about cleaning up Rob's mess. I watched as one of the lawyers underlined it slowly, without saying a word, and I realized they'd already seen it before. They weren't shocked. They were confirming motive. What struck me most during that testimony wasn't the way they listened, or the way they occasionally exchanged glances when I mentioned Carl's name. It was how much of the damage had already been cataloged. I wasn't telling them anything they didn't already suspect. What I was doing was giving weight to a pattern. Apparently, Drew's name had surfaced in connection with 2 other cases, both involving misreported financials and falsified performance data. One contractor had already flipped. Another had submitted a formal complaint. My testimony, they said, would help establish a consistent behavior model, not just corporate misconduct, but deliberate manipulation, carried out with the knowledge, if not the direct approval, of senior leadership. I wasn't just helping them build a case. I was becoming a key to its structure. They asked me if I believed Carl was complicit. I said yes, not because I had a smoking gun with his name on it, but because you don't accidentally ignore this many red flags unless you've already decided which color you want to see. Carl wasn't dumb. He knew exactly who Drew was, what Drew was doing, and what Drew made easier: plausible deniability. You keep someone like that around when you want to win, but don't want to get your hands dirty. You feed him opportunities, shield him from oversight, and when things go south, you blame the guy whose name was left holding the bag. After the session, one of the agents escorted me to the elevator, silent at first, then turned and said something I hadn't expected. He told me that this kind of case doesn't usually get this far, not because the fraud isn't real, but because the people it hurts don't often have the patience to wait it out. He said most whistleblowers quit halfway. Most witnesses vanish. Most people, good people, decide that maybe the fight just isn't worth dragging into the daylight. But I had waited, and more importantly, I had documented. In the weeks that followed, I heard things. Nothing official, just whispers through back channels and the occasional message from a former coworker who still had enough decency to keep me in the loop. Drew had been placed on administrative leave. Carl had stepped down from his executive role for personal reasons. The company had launched an internal review. A few of the clients involved in the Polaris fallout had been contacted for interviews. It wasn't a dramatic fall from grace. There were no headlines, no handcuffs, no cathartic moment where I got to watch Drew escorted out with his box of awards and his smug smile finally cracked in two. What happened was quieter, slower, more permanent. He disappeared from LinkedIn. His profile went private. His name, once attached to every internal spotlight feature and social media brag post, was suddenly missing from the narrative. The man who had spent so much time building his persona on borrowed credit had finally overdrawn the account, and the system, sluggish, self-protective, but not blind, had started to correct itself. Not out of morality, not out of guilt, but because someone like Drew is only useful as long as his trail can be buried. And once someone like me steps up with a shovel full of receipts, the only thing left to do is back away and pretend you never invited him in the first place. As for me, nothing miraculous happened. No recruiter suddenly knocked on my door with a dream role and a six-figure package. No movie deal. No grand applause. I still haven't found the right next job. I still drink my morning coffee with a little too much silence in the room. I still feel the sting sometimes when I think about how much I gave to that company and how little it took for them to forget me. But I sleep better now. I walk taller, even if the path is still uphill. And every time I see someone half my age trying to outmaneuver integrity with charm and buzzwords, I smile a little, not bitter, not smug, but knowing. Because they called me when it mattered. Because when the house of cards started shaking, I was the one holding the record of every misplaced piece. And because sometimes the only real justice is knowing the truth didn't die in the dark. Did I do the right thing? Or was it just revenge dressed up as righteousness? I don't know. Maybe it's both. Maybe there's no difference. But I do know this. If you wait long enough, if you stay quiet and patient, and just keep your record straight, eventually the people who think they're untouchable start tripping over their own footprints. And when they fall, they always look around for someone to blame. This time, the only person left in the room with the facts was me, and I wasn't cleaning up anyone's mess. Not anymore.